Hi, Lyssa deHart here. Want to start off by saying that we're going to be talking about storytelling and clients who don't get to the topic. So I want to start out by saying thank you to the people taking the survey that I put out about what's of interest to you to get videos on. And the question that came up that recently is, what comes to mind is how to take charge when a client wants to tell a story versus getting into the topic. And so today, what we're going to do is look at 4 things that I think will help you to really navigate these long stories and getting to what's important. All right, let's take a look at this. So, the first thing that I am really curious about is this idea of the word take charge. And I've got 2 minds of this. So, I'm going to go with both of them. The first thing is, what does it mean for a coach to take charge? I'm not sure that I think it's the coach's job to take charge and direct the client in a particular direction. So, that may be my bias, but I do understand hearing a really long story and not knowing what to do with it, which is, I think, really what is below that particular question, which really takes us to the second mind that I have about that, which is whoever asks the questions is actually in charge of the conversation. So if you're the coach and you have a client who comes into the conversation and downloads a really long story for you, and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this? It's such a long story. I would invite you to go back to what was the question that you asked that began this long story. I just had a mentor coaching session with one of my coaching clients, and they had brought a conversation forward where that exact thing happened. They asked a question and the client downloaded for the next 5 minutes a story about this, that, and the other thing at their work situation. And my coach client said to me, I didn't know how to break into that. I didn't know what to ask. I just sort of froze because there was so much information. 5 minutes is a really long time to try and remember stuff. And so one of the things that we looked at was, what was the question that led to this giant download? In this particular case, the question was, what is your topic for today? Seems innocuous enough, right? Coaches ask this question all the time. Yet with this particular client, that led to a story that was really long and didn't actually get to a point of anything. And so we began kind of thinking about the competencies and thinking about agreement setting and looking at the markers around agreement setting. And there's no marker that says coach asks for topic. Coach asks what's important to the client. And so what would a question like a choice point be was one of the things that we were looking at. What's important for us to take a look at in our conversation today? I think that's another thing that a coach can do is set a parameter. In our 30 minutes today, what's going to be important for us to explore? What's showing up is most important for us to noodle through today. And so what we're doing is we're directing the client, we're priming the client in a direction where they're going to be thinking about what's important to talk about during the time frame that we have versus just what's your topic. And I think this is really important because anytime you are in charge of asking the questions, you're the person leading the client in a particular direction. So for instance, if I say, what's your favorite color? All of a sudden, whether or not you want to be thinking about your favorite color probably pops into your mind and you're like, oh, my favorite color is whatever. And you're like, thanks, Lyssa. What did that have to do with anything? So maybe it wasn't a particularly useful question for you, but I'm priming you in a particular direction. And so you are in charge if you're the coach. If you're asking the questions, you are in charge. And so in that regard, make sure that your questions are leading the client someplace useful. If they're too broad and vague in the sense of like, what do you want to talk about today? The client may not know exactly and muddle all over the place. If you say what's important for us to talk about today, the client still may not know, but they're at least more primed towards something important. And they may say, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I've been sort of wrestling with some idea. And I think I want to kind of explore that a little bit and see what comes up. Okay, cool. Right? Like whatever they say is fine, but at least we're starting to get them kind of honed in on what's important. And then we can do more reconfirming of, if you're wanting to muddle around with something, what would be different if we muddle around with it enough? And they'll tell you what that is. And then you start to create that container of a coaching conversation. I think the other thing that I really want to throw in here is, especially when we get a long download, is why do people share long stories with us? And I think there's a myriad of reasons why people do this. One of the reasons I think people share really long stories with their coach or their therapist or their friend or their whoever is that we don't like keeping this sort of stuff in our head all the time. It's like it can just kind of bounce around and knock around in our noggin. And we sometimes need to kind of get it out of our head. So there may be a reason for the download. I think there are people who are internal processors, and I think there are people who are external processors. And then there's people like me who do a bit of internal processing and then external processing. I like to do it all. And there are times where I have felt the need with my own coach where I'm like, I just need to come in here and I've got some stuff I need to say first and make sense of it by saying it out loud before I can even start to unpack it and work on it. And so, what is the purpose of the story that your client is sharing? Because there may be a real reason behind it. I think also, if I share the story and I share it with my coach, and my coach is able to come back and help me to kind of explore what's important about that story through reflection and inquiry, it gives me a way of looking at the story from a different perspective than maybe I have it. Because remember, I mean, we all live with these glasses or lenses fixed firmly to our face, and how we are experiencing the situation is the lens in which we're looking at this story. And yet, from the external position of being the coach, because you don't have any, dog in this race, the fact is you have an opportunity to hear different perspectives that maybe I, in the middle of my story, I'm not aware of yet, right? So it's an opportunity sometimes also of being able to reflect back something to somebody, which really takes us into the other thing that we maybe want to be doing with these long stories, which is mining them for the themes that they're bringing forward. So going back to my mentor coaching client the other day, as we started to look at the download, that 5-minute download from her client, there were definite themes of feeling protective of another person at work, feeling helpless to know what to do, wondering how to support them. There were these themes that were showing up, though, that were really interesting. We didn't know if they were accurate or not, these themes that we were seeing, yet they're places of being curious. And so when I hear a long story, I'm often listening to the underlying themes, be it control or fear or feeling overwhelmed or maybe not feeling heard or not feeling like there's a situation in where there isn't trust. I think protective of other people. And imagine you're a person who's sharing a story and you don't feel heard and your coach is going, can you just get to the point? What's the point here? I mean, you're going to be demonstrating the exact thing they're talking about, which is, I don't feel heard. And I mean, I think a big part of this is how do we hear people? So listening for those underlying themes gives us a place to test our hypotheses about what's important. We don't know. We might say, like in the case with my mentor coach client the other day, I'm hearing a theme of what sounds a little bit like helplessness to know what to do, and also protectiveness of this other person. And I'm curious, as I say those words, if anything's showing up as important out of that. And the client will tell you yes or no. The client may say, no, it's not exactly that. It's this other thing that's showing up, whatever that is. Or they might be like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's exactly what it is. I'm feeling so helpless and I really do want to protect them. And I know that I had a protector when I first started at the organization, a mentor that was really supportive of me. And I really want to think about how I might be a good mentor to this other person, whatever, right? But we're getting to what's important to them. What about that is important then for us to explore today? We can continue on with agreement setting. Agreement setting doesn't mean that we ask 4 questions in a row to get to the answer. And maybe we ask what's important. We do a little evoking awareness in there, and then we get more clarity around what's going to be different at the end of the conversation and where the coach or client wants to begin the exploration between where they are now and where they'd like to be at the end of our 20, 30, 40 minutes. And so listening and mining these themes is like mine them because they're gold. These stories often tell you so much about the person that you're talking with and listening to. And this really brings us to the fourth thing to pay attention to when people are bringing a really long story. And this is most especially true if it's a pattern where they come and they're just sort of wandering around in a field telling you a story. What are your agreements around, interruption, number one, and number two, where are your questions leading clients into feeling like they need to give you all these details? I mean, sometimes clients do that all on their own, but if we look at our coaching also, and this is why I so highly recommend recording coaching calls and running them through a transcription process like Ray Notes, so that you can start to see what are your questions that you're actually asking, not the ones you think you're asking in your head, because if you're anything like me, what I thought I asked and what I actually asked may not be exactly the same, but what are the questions that you're asking? And if most of your questions are geared towards telling me more about the situation, the who, what, when, why, what, then what's going to happen is we're going to train our clients to come in with the who, why, where, when, what. Versus if we're asking much more open questions that invite the client into their own self-reflection, into what's really deeply important around what would be, how they're spending their energy, what themes that are showing up, all these different sorts of questions like that really invite the client internally. What we may find is that our clients come ready just to tell us all the details, and they need to, tell us all the details so that we can know, so then we can press on with the coaching. So it really is going to depend. And again, sometimes none of this is true. Sometimes people just like to tell stories, and the coach is going to be a bit in a place of then needing to go, how do I talk to the client about the fact that there's a lot of storytelling coming up here that is great if it's useful. And so finding out from the client, again, going back to agreement setting, how will we be with each other? And how are these stories useful to you, client, so that I can hold the space for the stories in a way that's meaningful to you? I've definitely had clients, and in fact, I think I have been the client who comes in at times and says, I need to just download all this information, and what I really need from you is just to hear me. And as the coach, I am like, bring it on, right? And so how do we go about being and holding the space that the client needs in order to be able to do the work they need to do to move forward in their life? So I hope this was useful. Thank you so much for filling out the survey and letting us know, or letting me know, what it is you'd like to hear in a video topic. And follow this link up here. It'll take you to another video that might be really useful as you're considering your coaching journey. And thank you again for being here, and I hope this was of use. Cheers.